Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We have a lot to get through, so I'm keen to start bang on time. Welcome to this panel. It's one of the last ones of the conference. I hope you've had a great time here, made some interesting connections, and had some great talks. My name is Jacqueline Rowe. I'm a content policy researcher. I work for a company based in London that does a lot of digital policy research and human rights advocacy within the digital space. And I'm really pleased to be here moderating this panel today. We have some excellent speakers. The topic, as you know, is AI, deepfakes, and surveillance, which is quite a broad area, and we're going to try and cover as much ground as we can. I will turn to you for some questions near the end, so please do, if you have questions as we're going along, store them up, and we'll come to the audience during the last part of the session. I'll briefly introduce our speakers, and then we'll just jump straight into the topic, I think. So on my left here, we have Bill Marczak, who is a senior researcher from the Citizen Lab, which is a research lab that's based at the University of Toronto. And Bill specializes in investigating surveillance and censorship tools that threaten internet freedom. We also have Sam Gregory next, who is the executive director of Witness. Witness is an organization that helps human rights defenders around the world use video and video footage to expose injustice. And Witness also does a lot of work on strengthening information ecosystems through training and technical innovation as well. Then we have Nighat, who is the executive director of the Digital Rights Foundation, which is an advocacy organization working in Pakistan to defend online freedom of expression and privacy, with a particular focus on women and minorities and dissidents there. Nighat also serves on Meta's oversight board and also on the UN Secretary General's high-level advisory body on AI. And I'm sure we'll hear a bit more about those two positions later. And last but not least, we have Lindsay Gorman, who is the Senior Fellow for Emerging Technologies and the head of the Technology and Geopolitics team at the German Marshall Fund. She has many years' experience in tech development and tech policy, and with a lot of expertise, particularly in US-China technology competition. So with that, great lineup. I'm really excited. I want to first turn to each of the panelists just for some opening remarks and to ask you, how do you see AI tools and technologies impacting civic freedoms in your contexts where you work around the world? And why is this topic, AI, deepfakes, and surveillance, why is it important to you and to your work? So we'll start with Bill, and we'll just go straight down the line, I think.
Great. Well, thanks for the introduction. I'm happy to be here. Some of you might recognize me from the phone checking booth that Citizen Lab ran at the past few days. So I, of course, work with Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto, and we're sort of a mixed methods shop, mostly academics who work on the intersection, essentially, of internet freedom and human rights. So I specialize in tracking surveillance, but others at the Citizen Lab look into issues like AI, disinformation, and deepfakes. And we sort of see both of these as related in the sense that both AI and surveillance can kind of, if you like, crowd out legitimate discourse in the sort of online civic space, in the sense that surveillance might make you afraid of expressing your true opinions, in the sense that, you know, even if you're running something like an anonymous account or you're trying to use a pseudonym, you might be worried that you'd be exposed for having certain opinions or saying certain things online. And similarly with the sorts of AI-assisted disinformation that we track, the goal behind those campaigns, like we've done a recent report about a campaign that a Chinese company undertook to try and pump up fake stories and pro-China narratives in the media. And we've also done past reports looking at Iranian-based actors conducting disinformation. And the common theme is that the actors are seeking to flood these online spaces, whether they be social networks or just the internet, with narratives that sort of crowd out legitimate narratives. So you've probably heard of the term coordinated inauthentic activity. So the idea is that these disinformation networks try and create what look like plausible human avatars, right? So they might use generative AI to create profile photos that sort of look like real humans, even though they're not people that actually exist, and they'd create Twitter or X accounts, Facebook accounts, Instagram accounts, using these avatars and using generated content in a way that doesn't make them at first glance immediately look related, even though they're pumping out related narratives. So the sort of work that we can do, often with collaboration or with assistance from some of these platforms where the disinformation is taking place, is to try and map out the extent of the activity and be able to prove or show or attribute and say, these 1,000 accounts that are promulgating these pro-government narratives are not in fact 1,000 organic individuals online, but are part of sort of a single entity trying to push a certain narrative and make that narrative look like it's popular. In terms of the tactics that we see being used, not only are sort of fake news articles being shared, or not necessarily fake news articles, but news articles that are sort of written to look like they're legitimate journalism, but actually might be front organizations. In some cases, we've seen evidence that these narratives and messages are sort of generated using these generative AI platforms. So one funny story and one easy way to detect some of this stuff is when you find accounts that look like that you suspect might be generating these sort of pro-government narratives inorganically. In some cases, we've been able to identify and see posts that these accounts have posted where instead of actual content, they'll say, I'm sorry, as a generative AI model, I cannot generate something about this topic. And the text is actually included in the Twitter post. And you can sort of say, well, that was probably generated by ChatGPT or something. But I think the worrying trend here, right, is that these generative AI systems are making it much easier to scale up these sorts of campaigns, right? In the past, you might have had to hire a bunch of different people to sit at their keyboards and write, tweets or write news stories. And nowadays, you could just sort of say, okay, ChatGPT, write me a 2,000-word article about this topic from a pro-government narrative, right? So the idea that it's reducing the cost and increasing the availability of this sort of inauthentic information, and information overload is harder to sort of sift through and determine what is organic versus what is inorganic. So that's sort of like a broad overview of the disinformation ecosystem as we see it, and the sort of surveillance that we track also kind of has a it's sort of a different angle on the same issue, right? The idea that you potentially you're constantly being watched. And of course, the reality is that, well, at least the reality so far has been, well, no, most people are not constantly being watched or monitored to see what they're planning or what they're thinking or what they're saying. But the sort of idea that you could be watched has a chilling effect on speech. And one of the worrying trends that might be coming down the pipeline is this idea that, well, why isn't everyone watched? And I think the answer is because the amount of information generated by that surveillance would be intractable to understand or make sense of. But the worry, of course, is that with these new artificial intelligence type systems, you could feed in data gathered by a surveillance application like Pegasus or other types of spyware that we track or other sorts of surveillance methodologies, and sort of generate a summary of relevant information about the target. And this could help scale up the surveillance, because obviously one of the hard parts of surveillance is finding out relevant information in all the haystack that you're gathering from the target. So worrying trend, but I don't want to take up too much time.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Phil. We'll come back to some of those things, I think, later in the discussion. But for now, I'll turn to Sam. And what's your take on this topic?
Sure. Thanks, Jackie. And I recognize some faces for people who've already sat through an hour with me earlier today. So you're gluttons for punishment. I hope other people are more interesting than I was for the hour I spent earlier today talking about AI and elections and deepfake detection. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I mentioned in that workshop, which is I work for Witness, which is a human rights organization that supports the millions of people who take out their phones to document human rights violations or engage in civic journalism. And so by definition, we're concerned about how they both reinforce the credibility of the information they gather and also confront rumors that are often and mis and disinformation that are communicated in audiovisual format. We focus on video and audiovisual contexts. that led to us, and where I ground my expertise in is 6 or 7 years ago, it's like 7 years ago now, we started the first sort of global civil society effort as we described it, prepare, not panic around deepfakes and synthetic media, and think, what do we do if we ground this in a conversation that is related to the actual, oh, did I just conk out?
Maybe a battery. Technical difficulties on a panel about technology.
Going, is that working?
Oh.
Yes. Come back. Okay. It's a ghost. It's a ghost in the room, or it's surveillance and intervention. So we started working on this, and what we really wanted to do, and this is grounded in the realities of existing harms. And I think we often exoticize AI, and Bill is describing it in a very grounded way as well. And this is what we heard as we talked to human rights defenders. And we constantly go back to talk with human rights defenders and journalists about what they're actually experiencing and how they relate it to what they want and need. And so they correlate it very closely, the phenomenon of synthetic media, to existing problems of surveillance, right? How are people going to use this? How are people going to use it to target women, women human rights defenders, women journalists, knowing that's already one of the patterns of misuse? They link it to closing civic space and how this will be another tool to target the most vulnerable, to compromise their accounts. And of course, they link it back to the fact that everyone has always challenged human rights defenders' accounts and said they're false. So I think that's one thing to do as we look at this phenomenon and as we start to assess it, is to ground it in that existing reality. What we've been doing practically is we do very direct work that's about training human rights defenders and journalists. We run the only rapid response mechanism globally for suspected deepfakes. And from that, we've learned a few things. We've learned that there is a very wide range of ways people use AI in the real world that range from very direct attacks, right? Private attacks with non-consensual sexual images to public deception attacks. But people are also using it often for satire. And then the lines get blurry around satire when it loses its context. People are using it to communicate. And people are using the existence of AI to deny reality, right? And so about half the cases we had in the first year of the Rapid Response Force were real footage where someone was denying a piece of compromising content and using the threat of AI to deny it. And so I think that's really important to reflect on, is that this helps blur the lines around what is real and false, as well as allow you to create perhaps a greater volume, a greater realism, a greater variety of synthetic information, as Bill was talking about. And then when you layer on top of that, you have a challenge that those civil society groups and journalists don't have access to the way to do this detection rapidly and quickly, even at the existing scale. So I'm not an apocalyptic person about where we're at with AI. I think we're at a relatively low scale of impact, but I see the capacity of civil society and journalists to react, and it is low when we look at it across the board. And that's partly technical, that the tools are never going to work great. It's partly skills, it's partly resources. The other part of our work is to think how the needs and necessities of human rights defenders translate to the systems level. So we do a lot of work at the policy level. I've testified before the US House and Senate, and also engaged with many policymakers about how we think about how we could have a much more systemic response. And I'm excited that we can talk about this on the panel and think about what does it take to give people transparency on how AI is used in the content, and how do we do that without having surveillance, right? Because otherwise we're creating systems that might, for example, tell you that someone made something with AI, but that shouldn't be linked to the identity of the person making something with AI, right? And how do we think about the systemic challenges of ensuring access to detection, of doing this right? So I think we really have to bind this all together. And one thing I should say as a human rights activist in this space is it's critically important our voices are in that space. And I say that not as our voice witness, but the voices of human rights defenders globally, because that's how you raise the issues of, like, how do you have privacy and access and non-discrimination in the technical design that is happening now. So what I'll leave as a final thought is, I don't think we're in an apocalyptic AI elections year. I think we're in a year where we need to make sure we're starting to lay really good foundations, technically and policy-wise, for years that will be a lot worse in terms of the generative capacity of AI to create volume, variety, to use video, to create much more of this. So think of this as the year we need to start getting it right.
Wonderful, thank you, Sam. And we'll definitely talk a bit more about what some of those technical and policy foundations could look like, I hope, in a little while. Nighat, turning to you, what's your take on the topic?
Yeah, so based on what Bill and Sam already said, so I have seen this like this whole like discourse around AI and AI hype that is going on at the moment. And when I look at the rest of the world and not the North, I see the existing inequalities that we have still we haven't really grappled with. So people are still dealing with digital divide, lack of digital literacy, inadequate infrastructures, internet shutdowns. And I don't think that, and also the problem with the social media platforms. And I don't think that we have dealt with that fully, and now with this whole discourse around AI is actually blurring the existing inequalities that we already have in the majority world. So, but at the same time, I personally, my organization, Digital Rights Foundation, we recently had elections in Pakistan in February, and to your point around readiness of civil society, we knew that something will happen around using AI or AI-generated content, but we didn't know the to how much extent this will be used by the actors who are more sophisticated or who have more resources. And I'll talk about elections later. But I don't think that many of us were ready to even monitor, how much deepfake and AI-generated content, especially coming from political parties, sort of hijacked the space and blurred, the true factual information in the online space. And I think when I look at the marginalized communities, we work with young women and girls, religious minorities, gender minorities in the country and South Asia. And I think one thing that worries me is the reduced cost of and accessibility of AI tools, where deepfakes can be generated so easily. You don't need social media cells anymore by certain bad actors. One person can do this job with reduced cost. And I think the worry is the virality of such content in patriarchal societies, where just like a usual image of a woman, which is not even intimate, can put her at risk. I see women human rights defenders, women journalists, women female politicians in the recent elections, how they had to face a barrage of deepfakes and AI-generated audios and videos about them, which sort of pushed them to actually take a step back from these spaces and actually do their election campaigns, or female journalists doing actual reporting on elections. Yep.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nighat. Lindsay, over to you for some opening remarks.
Thank you. So I lead the technology program at the German Marshall Fund, which is a policy analysis and research organization. We're a nonprofit think tank based in Washington, D.C., but we have 6 offices throughout Europe. So transatlanticism and democratic values in the transatlantic relationship is really at the heart of all of our work, including the technology work that my team works on. And I think AI has been on our radar for some time now. We focus on making sure that democracies, democratic values, and democratic governance win the strategic technology competition vis-a-vis autocrats. Obviously, that's not a clean framing, I think, as we're seeing, within democratic societies, there are threats to democratic values, as well as from autocratic forces without. So our lines of research and policy analysis, and we don't really do advocacy, but policy recommendations and engagement with policy stakeholders, both in Washington and throughout European capitals, is really focused on, I think, 2 core dimensions where AI has a role to play in both. First, on contesting some of the autocratic technological threats that we're seeing, and we focus primarily on the PRC, the People's Republic of China, as a threat actor. And I think this really started about 5 years ago, when we were trying to raise awareness, particularly in Europe, but also in the United States, on how China was building out telecommunications infrastructure in the US, in Europe, and also around the world. And there were heated debates, I'm sure many of you may remember, on the question of the Chinese telecommunications companies Huawei and ZTE and their presence in 5G networks throughout Europe and globally. And the case that we've really tried to make, and others have too, is that of a frame of a digital technology stack. That when we think about these pipes of the internet, the 5G, the 4G, even now we're talking about 6G, we're not only talking about the pipes and the layers, but really the added dependencies and the advantages in the upstream layers of the stack, the cloud ecosystem, the data centers, the application layer of the internet, and indeed the AI systems, the facial recognition systems, the smart cities, the surveillance technologies that get built on top of these layers. And what we found in our work, and this is a while ago now, is that companies like Huawei were not just building the internet infrastructure, but were actually also building the smart city and safe city technology that contained a lot of surveillance equipment. And then on a governance layer, we're playing a large role in international standard setting bodies, these technical organizations that come together and decide sort of what kind of USB-C or USB-A port goes for each technology. They were coming into these bodies and promoting standards that I think many would agree were in direct contravention of democratic values and human rights, building ethnicity, for example, into facial recognition cameras and surveillance technologies, and using this kind of low infrastructure advantage to corral nations around the world to support their standards and ultimately their governance views. So I think there's a sort of the surveillance component of this that we're trying to combat. And then when we move into generative AI, the large language models that we're all familiar with, ChatGPT, we're seeing an emerging model in China where, of course, and probably unsurprisingly, there are indeed restrictions on what these language models can produce. Just like you're not going to see a picture of Xi Jinping next to Winnie the Pooh on the internet without AI, you're definitely not going to see that through a DALL-E, the Chinese version of DALL-E, or AI-generated content. And I think what's really concerning there, too, is I think we're going to see the same thing happen that we did in the social media era, where even companies that are based in the US, like OpenAI, have a really strong motivator to try to capture pieces of the Chinese market. And so what compromises will they make? What will they be willing to suppress in order to capture that market? That's one question I'm watching. And then sort of the other half of our work, I said we're focused on contesting the autocratic technology threats, but then we're also thinking about what does democratic AI governance look like? How can we build our values into the next generation of technologies to go viral? I think this was something we really failed at with social media. We just assumed naively that social media, because it's this great connector, would be inherently democratizing. With Tahrir Square and the Arab Spring, we had maybe perhaps a small inkling of reason to believe that. At the same time, however, actors like Russia and the PRC and other autocratic forces were really sowing the seeds of distrust and actually even building their own value systems into internet technologies really from the beginning. And I think we were pretty ignorant and naive about how those models, the Great Firewall, et cetera, Russia's SORM, would succeed. So we have a line of effort on what I like to call democracy-affirming technologies, where we're trying to bake in some of our democratic values and incentivize the development of technologies that have those values baked in, things like trust, transparency, equity, openness, sort of under the idea that it doesn't have to necessarily always be the technologies that end up kind of degrading democracy, particularly in the information space, that go viral. And so one line of effort we're really interested in, and I'm sure others will talk about on the panel, and we can go into some more detail later in the discussion, are these content provenance and authenticity technologies. And we see them as a potential counter, not the full Monty, but one piece of the pie in order to bake in the democratic value of transparency and trust into content that we see, so that when we're faced with this onslaught of generative content, images, videos, etc., the good actors can authenticate, well, we've put this out, here's the image modification history that it's gone through from when we got it from our photographer to it went to our content management system, and we're finally displaying it to the browser, and then you get it on your social media site. So has been generated, how it's been modified, allowing media organizations to show their work. So we've piloted that with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and with a local photojournalist agency in Mexico in their context of their elections just this past weekend. And we're looking to expand out the use of one of these democracy-affirming technologies as a way to partially counter some of the harms that I think we're seeing in this historic election year with AI and deepfakes.
Amazing, thank you, Lindsay. And that's actually a great segue. I think it would be good to talk a little bit more about some of the technical measures that Lindsay was just mentioning. And I'd maybe like to turn to Sam to come in on this this kind of C2PA kind of stamping of where images have come from and who's created them and where. And I wonder if you could walk us through a little bit the technicalities of that, like how it works and how Witness and you in your work are trying to advocate for that to be taken up more broadly by different actors.
Sure, and Lindsay's introduction was perfect. It was describing one of the use cases of these approaches, which is, it's this idea at the heart of it that in a really complex era of understanding what is AI and human, which might not be malicious or negative, it just is something we're going to need to know much more clearly, both to trust what is real, where that's important to do that, know what is synthesized, and know whether that matters to us. We need to have a much better way of sort of disclosing that. Now, one way we can disclose it is the really imperfect way that we do now, which is a lot of what the companies have rolled out and what we're kind of used to, which is like made with AI labels. Made with AI labels, what does that mean? I don't know what that means exactly, except with really blunt examples of like it's purely an image out of DALL-E or out of an image generator. But that's what you see at the moment, is kind of made with AI labels, either added by a platform or added by the user. The idea of media transparency approaches that include these provenance approaches is that you should be able to find ways to more closely link the trajectory of how media was created, the recipe of a media item to a media item, right? So you might do that by including metadata, right, that explains that it was created with a particular tool, edited in a certain way, distributed in a certain way. And that might be information that, as Lindsay describes, is about a piece of really critical real footage shot in an election context, where you might do non-material modifications to it, and you might edit it, maybe to obscure the identity of someone who's vulnerable. But that doesn't mean people shouldn't trust it. They should just know that's happened. Or it might be the opposite. You make something with AI, and you want to explain to people you made it with AI, and then you maybe included a human element, you mixed it together and edited, right? We're going to be in a very complex media ecosystem where it's not a binary of AI or not. And so what you've seen is a range of ways being developed to do that. One approach is something called the C2PA, the Content Provenance and Authenticity approach, which is a standard that's trying to combine these kind of metadata packages, right? Metadata being information about a media file that is cryptographically signed and in some cases can be reconnected to a media package. I want to take one step back because Witness has been part of this process. In fact, human rights groups pioneered the idea of trying to like validate the real, starting in 2011-12. Groups like Witness and others like Eyewitness to Atrocities built tools to validate the real, like from war crimes, right, to show that something hadn't been tampered with. So we also know a lot of the challenges about doing this right. And when we came into, for example, the C2PA process, we led a working group in the technical standards part of it, because people are building like these underlying specifications to try and raise the concerns we heard from human rights groups and the people we work with globally, to try and emphasize that as you do this, how do you think about the things that are of concern to people who are vulnerable already? And just to be clear about some of those things that we've heard that are really critical to build in there. People say, we don't want this to be privacy compromising and linked to identity because we don't trust our governments or technology companies with identity. And we don't believe you should have a backdoor to identity via a way to address the problems of AI. They talk about access, right, and who gets trusted, right? If you use a tool, you may be trusted, but that's only because you have a technology, right? We should never link technology to trust. We need to think very carefully about that. They asked questions about whether this would be available in open source in a range of ways, right? Otherwise it reinforces monopoly power. And they also said, be really attentive to how this links to governments who are trying to pass things like fake news laws and disinformation laws and are looking for mechanisms this could be wrapped into. So it's a technical solution that has real value for media transparency. I want to know when AI is used so I can make a decision whether it's a silly meme video on TikTok that I don't care about or someone trying to deceive me, but we have to build it right. And that's really the struggle, as I say, for this year, is to get that right, because a lot of the companies, a lot of the regulation is around this area of media transparency. So that's why it's really important our eyes are on that.
Brilliant, thank you, Sam. And on that note as well of the role of companies in both supporting these kinds of initiatives in the right ways that aren't going to lead to further problems, but addressing their own role in this kind of information disorder which these AI tools can generate. I wonder, Bill, could you comment a bit on what's the responsibility of companies in this? Not perhaps both companies which are producing the AI tools, the developers themselves and people that are deploying it, but then also the big social media networks that are hosting AI-generated content and all the potential risks that comes with that.
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I think right now we're sort of in the infancy of a lot of these generative AI tools, and one aspect of that, right, is that there are, sort of a few big players that have trained these extremely complex models using, massive amounts of data. They have really beefy computers that run these things. So it's not currently the case that, I could run on my laptop like a generative AI, like a video or picture generative model, which is going to have, the same high quality results as something that like, OpenAI or one of those companies would produce. So I'm not sure we'll always be in that sort of realm, right? It could be the case, right, that these models will get more and more sophisticated, more and more computational power will be in the hands of the sort of average person with a laptop. And any sort of steps that, we might call on AI companies to undertake in terms of the services they provide might not be translated or applicable to models that might run on our personal computers. That said, we're not quite there yet. So in terms of what we can do in the short term, I think it's sort of useful to adopt approaches where sort of like having civil society get a seat at the table with these companies and sort of raise concerns, sort of have a model where there's, various techniques employed to, cajole the companies into taking steps that would be, beneficial in terms of reducing the harm to democratic processes and elections and, just the general public from some of these tools. So I think that process would be that sort of process would be useful in the short term. And I think AI companies have a responsibility to make sure that they're, doing all they can to make sure that the tools are not being abused, and if there are these sort of abuses, that they are, investigating and taking action to remedy the situations. So we see with, a lot of tech companies, like you think of, social media platforms like Facebook, like Twitter, well, maybe not so much Twitter now, but they have anti-abuse teams or trust and safety teams, which sort of not only deal with, looking at how to prevent these sorts of abuses, but also investigate these cases of abuse and try to understand who are the people that are manipulating or using platforms in a certain way that contravenes policies. Is this some sort of organized activity? And if it is, then how do we sort of track it over time and potentially take steps to thwart the abuse of the tools? So maybe that means stepping in at key moments to disrupt activity, like we see. I think it was a couple weeks ago, Meta put out a report saying, we've tracked and shut down 6 different disinformation campaigns. One of them, I think, was a company based in Israel that was, using generative AI content to influence the debate about, Israel-Palestine. And there were, I think, a few other governments on the list too. So having that capacity not just in the tech platforms, the social media platforms, but also sort of having that capacity built up within the AI companies themselves, who ultimately can have good telemetry and understanding about how the tools are being used, could potentially be fruitful. And not only having the companies build up these capacities themselves, but collaborating with researchers, I think, is particularly important, and not just sort of company X based in Silicon Valley collaborates with Stanford University, but sort of finding ways to broaden that, to not just the sort of Western universities, but also universities all around the world, in global majority countries too, who the people there are obviously closer to some of the most current harms of these tools, and information that the AI companies and the social media platforms can share with these sorts of research labs or investigation labs can help not only map out and attribute, but understand the breadth of the harms. And once that information is sort of distilled and made public, that can be sort of fed into additional policy and other recommendations.
Yeah. Brilliant, thanks, Bill. Coming to this question of feeding into policy processes, and one of the things that you were just saying, Bill, was how it's sort of almost repeating, traditional online social media platforms have now got this kind of quite rich system of trust and safety, professionals and teams and policy experts within the company working on these issues, and that's maybe still nascent for some of the newer AI companies. But I guess in the same way, we've seen lots and lots of governments all around the world pass new legislation regulating online platforms, and there's been this big wave of kind of online safety legislation, and we're maybe also facing then a new wave of legislation around AI tools and AI products. And I wondered, Lindsay, if we could come back to you. You mentioned in your opening remarks that China has been regulating quite aggressively on this front, potentially raising concerns from a freedom of expression perspective. But I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about the Chinese government's approach to AI regulation and how it differs perhaps from other approaches around the world, and what you would want to see in that sort of national legislation on AI.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's interesting because one thing that I think around the world approaches to AI regulation have in common is that they have dual objectives. One is the regulatory piece that you mentioned, and I think where we're coming from of let's make sure our values, let's make sure our human rights are protected in the age of AI. And then every government that has put out anything on AI also has the goal, which I think might even be first and foremost in many governments' mind, of let's win the AI race. Let's make sure that we are competing in AI, that we are capturing the economic advantage from AI. You see that in the US, you see that in the EU, you see that in the UAE trying to now be with data as the new oil, kind of a leader in AI. Every country wants to lead in AI, and so all of these frameworks I think need to be viewed as sort of two sides of that coin. So, for example, in the US, our executive order contains a number of sort of AI competitiveness measures. I mean, the fact that the US Congress was able to even pass the Chips and Science Act was this sort of historic reversal of decades of underfunding in the US research and development and science technology enterprise. A lot of that was based on the recognition that emerging technologies like AI are going to be drivers of national competitiveness. And so we see that in China too, where I think China is unique in some ways is, first of all, on that kind of competitiveness side, it's definitely far more state-directed and state-driven than most of the approaches that we've seen. Most of sort of the innovation approaches that we've seen from other governments are about trying to find ways to spur innovation in particular areas. So, for example, spur innovation. And it's my hope that we would try to spur innovation in technology areas that accord with our values. Like, let's give some incentive to build these content authenticity systems. You see on the US side, we're trying to invest in privacy-preserving AI and privacy-preserving machine learning. So I think from the Chinese side, there's also, very concerningly, a strong tie with the military. A lot of the innovation is happening in PLA research labs, People's Liberation Army research labs, and I think on the competitiveness piece, we can't ignore the effective U.S. export controls that are targeting China's chip sector, specifically because of how China's using AI in its military applications. And by the way, unlike for all the criticism of the U.S. Defense Department, unlike the U.S. Defense Department and other democracies, neither China nor Russia has signed anything saying we will always have a human in the loop in military AI, and that was one of the topics at issue in the most recent U.S.-China meeting about where AI was raised. So there's the military case, but I think really critical also in these export controls in the chip sector is an explicit mention, probably for the first time in the history of export control use, on human rights considerations. So actually a number of the blacklisted firms that are on the U.S. entity list from China are companies like iFlyTech and SenseTime that are building China's surveillance state using AI. So I think that's been a turn in US foreign policy to target an approach which is somewhat unique to China in that China is the world leader in AI surveillance technologies. That's the industry they've really dug into and then been able to build out. And I think there's a competitive play to it too, because we know AI systems run on data. As Bill and Sam were mentioning, that OpenAI and these companies need massive, massive amounts of data, borrowing and stealing it potentially even to train these models. And if you're a surveillance state collecting data, I think China's approach is let's just collect it all, the DNA data, the facial data, the gait, walking and gait analysis data, and then we'll figure out what to do with it afterwards. Could lead to some competitive advantages. And then on the regulatory side, we've seen, I think, one of the most encouraging developments from democracies has been, I think, in the EU AI Act, for example, there's a transparency requirement on political AI. That's something that a number of US states are also trying to build in to counter deepfakes in the election context. On the Chinese side, the number one driver of regulation in China is state control and state security. And so I think it's really tempting to say, well, look, China's regulating so aggressively, why can't the US do that? Why can't we as democracies get our act together and regulate AI? And I kind of agree with that. But the reason that if you actually sort of peel back the onion and see, well, what's actually being regulated? It's making sure that all the chatbots conform to core socialist values, that you're never going to get a chatbot errantly spitting something out that doesn't have the CCP ideology in it. And I think what's concerning could be if those technologies succeed, and right now I don't think they're more competitive than some of the other technologies out there, which is good. If these technologies succeed, if these technologies get adopted around the world, we could wake up one day and find, well, our history is kind of rewritten. If we don't preserve some of our sources of public knowledge, our libraries, for example, if all of our knowledge, maybe Wikipedia is a great source. What if it becomes this generative AI landscape that may not be totally written according to our values? I think so. Those are some of the concerns with that regulatory approach.
Thank you, Lindsay. Very comprehensive overview. I think there's so much to think about in terms of the different drivers of regulation in this space, and being not being naive as to what the aim of that regulation is. I want to turn to the audience for questions in just a moment, but before that, I want to ask a question to Nighat. Lindsay's discussing some of the incentives that governments have in regulating AI, but you sit on two kind of international bodies, for want of a better word, the UN High-Level Advisory Panel on AI and Meta's Oversight Board, which I believe is also looking at AI and disinformation-related issues. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about the approach to this issue from both of those organizations, and where you think the challenges are in gathering kind of global consensus around how to approach this.
Yeah, I think sitting on these two bodies, one of my main objective is to bring global South voices on the table that Bill already mentioned, and what we have seen so far, even in the past decade around social media platforms, the debate was mostly driven by global North, and it's not only the discourse that we are talking about. I'm also talking about technologies that are being designed, developed, and then deployed in the global South, and we have become a testing ground of those technologies. And then there are lessons learned that tech companies, governments in the North sort of learn from this testing ground and kind of identify what are the harms, what are the opportunities from these technologies. And my frustration sort of come from this past one decade, and now what is exactly happening, the same thing is happening to the AI discourse and the AI technologies as well. Sitting on these two bodies mean that trying to at least making an effort to bring voice from global majority world and give a reality check to these institutions that there is the rest of the world that exists, whose voice is not being heard most of the time, and what can be done when we are so at the Matters Oversight Board, when we take up cases, we make sure that we listen to the appeals from the majority world, global south, but at the same time, company also reaches out to us when they are struggling with some stuff. We have taken up one case which is on the deepfake, but we made sure that we do not only take up a case which is emerging from like a Hollywood, a big celebrity. This is anonymous while we took up the case. At the same time, we took up a case from Bollywood as well, from India. And we wanted to see whether if this platform, Meta, is going to address both these cases in the same manner, how they implement their community guidelines. And so this is still under deliberation, but at the UN high-level advisory board, we almost have come to our term is ending, and in September there is a summit of the future where we'll be releasing our report, which is being addressed to the UN Secretary General, but also to the member states. And in that, we basically try to see how AI should be governed globally. And we identified gaps that the debate and discourse is very much in the global north, the rest of the world is not included. There is a conversation around talent, conversation around technology. That report will be finalized in September. But I think these are some of the efforts, and I feel that we should not really talk from isolation. We are talking about regulation as well. And it's very interesting to see that some of the regulations in the EU and in the US, very quickly governments sort of, initiated those efforts. But then some parts of the world, if there is no discourse, there won't be safeguards and guardrails around regulation as well. So when governments will come up with regulations, those will be more towards controlling users instead of addressing the issue. So that's my problem with this like emergence of regulatory framework in one part of the world and not the rest of the world.
Brilliant. Thank you. I want to open up to the audience. And I think we have a microphone that can rove around. If you do have a question, could you please raise your hand and maybe introduce yourself as well? No questions. Clearly you've all fixed it. Great, okay, brilliant. And if we can keep questions quite brief, we'll maybe take 2 or 3 at a time and then come back to the panelists. Thank you.
Are there any similarities between what we've seen with consumer surveillance and what you're describing now, where governments will take advantage of collecting data and surveying us? Have we learned any lessons from consumer surveillance?
Great, thank you. And we'll just take one more question as well and then come back. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Arnold from Zimbabwe. Sam, this is yours. You spoke about the importance of the privacy for human rights defenders in the context of, I think, the regulatory framework, I think, for AI. But then I was wondering how you can explain how to balance between protecting the privacy, the incognito versus accountability, because of the fact that AI by itself can really create a basis for which there can be serious, significant attacks on innocent people. But how do you then not live, especially if it's then generated through machines that learn? How do you get the human accountability and that balance between accountability and privacy? Thanks.
Great, thank you. So we had a question on the similarities with consumer surveillance and AI-powered surveillance. Is that correct, sir? And then another one on the relationship between or the fundamentalness of privacy, which seems to be directed at you. Maybe, Sam, do you want to start us off, as that was one
Sure,
for you?
and Arnold, I believe it was. I think this is a fundamental debate, as you know, right? Like, this is not unique to the question of AI. It's something we engage on around encrypted messaging, decisions about it. I think we should be careful to work out what we're legislating for and what we're trying to build a technical standard for, right? Like, my understanding is when we're talking about AI, we're trying to understand that AI is being used in what we're consuming. I think it's a big leap to then say we then need to understand who is the creator of media, right? Which is a discussion that's happening around online content more generally. I think it's, I'm not willing to take that leap. And I think it's one that we should be very careful about to tie media production broadly. This isn't even online identity. This is media production writ large, the ability to communicate, tying that all to identity. And if we look at this through the lens of like when we look for organized disinformation and some of the influence campaigns that Bill was referring to, a lot of the time you're not looking for individual perpetrators, you're looking for patterns. That's how you do this, right? So we also need to think when we're looking at malicious usages, often it's about understanding patterns of behavior, not just individuals. Now, that said, there are scenarios in which we might want to understand if there are malicious models that are used repeatedly, and there may be specific scenarios where we need to really think this through. And like, I'll give the example that there's a lot of debate around, and it's not so much around sort of deceptive AI writ large, it's around non-consensual sexual images and child abuse material, which is being created in huge volume with synthetic media. And that is a much more complex discussion, because that is an explicitly illegal behavior right from the start. So how do you think about that? But maybe you need legal sanctions on production, not identity requirements to handle that. Let me add just one other wrinkle on privacy, which is I think it's also really important we have the ability to opt out of being deepfaked as well, right? The other side of it, right? And so solutions that are about enabling people to poison data sets to try and make sure their images can't be used. We should also be thinking about privacy of ourselves as we are potentially manipulated, given the sort of the small amount of data that is required. So if we're thinking about the protection point of view, I think there are also privacy things we need to do.
Great, thank you, Sam. Would anyone else like to address the issue of consumer surveillance?
I mean, I could say a couple
Bill,
words, I guess.
do
I mean, at least in the context that I'm familiar with, consumer surveillance, surveillance by large tech platforms, let's say, ad tracking, things like this. I don't know that we've really learned a whole lot of lessons from that, at least in the context of the United States. I mean, there's still sort of like a Wild West where, location-based information collected by apps and platforms is routinely available for purchase, and you can track and de-anonymize individuals from those sorts of data sets. So, I mean, I think part of the conversation is also not only just the generative component, but also the collection of the information, right? Where is the information being collected from for training the AIs? And part of that is probably an aspect of consumer surveillance, right? Information about content that you're writing, perhaps even like private posts or direct messages. I seem to recall there was like some case recently where, I think it was Slack. They announced that they were going to, by default, for all the messages, even if they were like direct messages or private messages or non-public Slacks that people can't just join, they were going to use that to train sort of an AI model within Slack. And I think the outcome of that, I don't know if there was any like backlash. I'm not sure if they said they were going to stop it. I think they're just going ahead. And if you want to opt out, you have to go through some complicated process to opt out. So part of, I think, the conversation here is also finding ways to ensure that data that you've created privately or data that shouldn't be public is not then used to generate these AI or to train the AI models in a way that information would leak to another customer that's supposed to be completely different, or to the public at large. So it's a complex question, I think, and I would hope that is something that could be addressed through regulation relatively non-controversially, in the sense of the pipeline from data collection to training the AIs.
Brilliant, thanks. So it really connects back to data privacy legislation and kind of protecting people's data and ownership of their data. Yeah. We have time, I think, for maybe one or two more questions. Yeah, we have a lady in the middle.
Hi, that was loud. I'm a teacher, and these are some of my students here. So ChatGPT is not my friend. But I also teach 1984, which it sounds, Sam, you're not ready to say that it's going to be like 1984 yet. But I do wonder, I have a question about TikTok, something that many of my students use regularly. And of course, the US government has tried to place this ban because they say there are national security concerns. I'm wondering, what are your guys' opinions about the banning of TikTok in terms of national security, surveillance, versus the argument for free speech and First Amendment rights?
Great, thanks. Maybe Lindsay, do you want to kick us off? And then
Sure, I'm happy to. Yeah, I mean, I've been one who's trying to raise awareness actually right around those national security concerns with TikTok for some time now, and I think the bill that's been passed in the U.S. Is really about severing the ownership link between TikTok and its Chinese owner ByteDance, which is ultimately accountable to the Chinese Communist Party. And so, yeah, to me, the outcome that I think, we've always been in favor of has been this forced divestiture, for which there is significant precedent, including with other Chinese social media apps like Grindr, for example, was found to be a national security issue because of the data it was collecting, obviously of a very sensitive nature. And there was a forced divestiture there because there was a Chinese tie of its owners. And so I think the appropriate action is the same thing in the case of TikTok, not a full-scale ban. I think it's clearly a very popular app. It's a very popular platform. But the concern really, in my mind, is actually even less about just the data collection, because everyone's collecting data all the time. Facebook, I think X is doing the same thing as Slack is doing, where it's, reading your private messages and using it to train AI. And yeah, maybe TikTok is collecting a little bit more than the average, but not enough to say, well, that's deserving of a ban. I think the real concern is that social media platforms are not just sort of passive collectors of information, but they're also promotion platforms. They're sort of the modern day like TV and radio and news stations. And so the concern is the type of information that's being collected on TikTok or any social media platform really is exactly the kind of information that a dedicated actor that wants to influence you would need to create the maximum amount of influence. And so why is this a national security issue and not just sort of a general consumer issue? It's that in China, there really aren't purely private companies. It's not really the same thing as like Google or Facebook or even X. And we have significant evidence of the Chinese Communist Party interfering in political processes around the world, both within its own country and outside. There was a case in New York where a Chinese dissident who had fled China and was running for Congress in New York, and there's this kind of sort of very searing DOJ indictment which paints a picture of these Chinese security agents actually trying to drum up information against him so that he wouldn't win. And they even said in the indictment, harm him physically if necessary so he cannot run. So to me, to give that kind of power to own a platform that everyone uses and everyone gets their information, including now political information, because more and more candidates, we saw last week or this week, Trump joined TikTok, President Biden's on TikTok, to have that ultimately be in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party, which is already exercising these other information and disinformation campaigns designed to denigrate the United States' role in the world across other platforms. That's where I think it's too big a national security risk to allow that ownership, which is not to say we should ban it, but rather try to sever that ownership link.
I just wanted to respond to that because I feel that this argument of national security is something that we have been criticizing authoritarian regimes, that they use this argument and then they ban platforms. We have seen this in several regions. And I think US is not setting a good precedent while doing that, because this argument can be used very easily around the world by different regimes, that if US can do it, why can't we do it? So I think it's, I'm not sure what could be the approach, but if democratic governments would start doing this, then it'll be very easier for other regimes to do the same. And I think it'll be difficult for democratic regimes then to come back and say, hey, when you are doing this in the name of national security, you are doing a wrong thing, while when we do this, it's a right thing. So I just wanted to intervene here because we see a lot of banning of these platforms in our part of the world by our governments.
Great. Thank you. I think we are 1 minute till the end of the session. I want to close by allowing each of our panelists to share, I guess, a note of looking forward, what the next 5 years, the next 10 years, and beyond. Where do you see, yes, concerns, but also some hopefulness around steps that are being taken to manage the risks of AI, and what would you like to leave us with as maybe the last session that most of us will go to as part of the OFF. So maybe we'll start at the other end this time. We'll start with you, Lindsay. Mm-hmm.
Sure. So I think, this is sort of on the positive and the concern, is that we're on the positive. I think we are in this moment now where governments are really trying to do something on AI in the regulatory sense, in a way that we never really did with social media. I think there's a smart recognition that self-regulation generally doesn't work that great for democratic values. Whether we can channel that sort of goodwill and desire to do something into something meaningful, I think is where it becomes a little murkier. But I think on the concerning side, on the positive side, the fact that we've seen so many pieces of legislation introduced, I think, does speak volumes. On the concerning side, I wonder how long this era of let's have AI work for humanity and not against it, how long it will last. And that there are going to be, bad actors, whether they're nation states or individual companies or just individuals themselves, that are going to crop up. For example, one company we've been looking into, CapCut, has these templates for AI-generated news anchors, and one thing they advertise on their website is no watermarks, no labels, so no made by AI, because it gets in the way of the art. And so I think, we're in an era now which is positive, where we would see that as, well, that's not good behavior. But I do worry that won't always be the case in 5 years, that there might be some attractive features of having no label, for example, and that those actors could end up getting segments of the market, despite our best efforts to kind of promote sort of better AI behavior.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Yeah, no, I think, as Lindsay said, I think it's a good moment where, we are not actually in a phase of catching up. We are in the, trying to address AI-related challenges at the moment. I think one thing that I feel is, I think Global South is also trying to be part of this conversation. And we are not in a phase where we are like, oh, please include us. We are actually doing South-to-South collaboration and see whether we can do things on our own and take ownership of this issue and see how we can address this in our part of the world. I think civil society is a very important component of this whole ecosystem, and I hope that we see more civil society, global north, global majority, both in all these conversations. Like, I'm sitting here talking about global majority a lot, so we want to see, I want to see more of this, And yeah, I think access to the third-party researchers, the data, I think that's something that we would like to see more, not just the traditional platforms, but also these new AI companies as well.
Brilliant.
I'm going to echo Lindsay and Nighat that if we get this right, we can do better than on social media. That's not setting the bar too high, but it feels like there's an opportunity now to not be fighting this rearguard battle that many of us and many societies have had to fight of what went wrong with social media and why is it being tested out and experimented on us. That's the good side. I have to admit, I try to be an optimist, but I'm a reluctant pessimist about its impact on human rights defenders and journalists, because it feels very outweighed, right? The idea that LLMs will create knowledge, that will have creativity, are all very well, but if you're trying to separate fact from fiction, do that in complex circumstances, I think that's a really challenging topic, and so I have less optimism in that space because I think it's going to be very hard for human rights defenders and journalists, given the existing pressures on their trust and credibility, on their financial resourcing from governments, from the changing tides of industry, how do we manage that? And I think that's where we also need to put resources and effort and say, it's pretty critical that we defend the credibility and trust in those intermediaries at a community level who communicate what is true and what is fiction, because we shouldn't trust LLMs to do it for us. Or to take your analogy, it's not 1984 for me, it's Brave New World. These like fictions we weave all around us at will are what we need to avoid. We need to know what is true and what is false.
Thank you, Sam. Bill, last word.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm perhaps largely optimistic, when thinking about things like generative AI, especially as it relates to generating images and things like this. It almost feels like, everything old is new again, right? Like back in the day, we had manipulated images, right? We had Adobe Photoshop. You could like Photoshop someone's head onto something else or create some sort of fabrication like this. Now, of course, like generative AI is way better. It reduces the cost, but it doesn't, at least to me, feel like there is something fundamentally new that is going on here in terms of, it's not something that we're completely clueless about its effect. We sort of understand images can be faked, things can be manipulated, and part of this is, the sort of the examples of generative AI that have gone really viral, like for instance, the Queens of England, the late Queen of England's fake, what was it, like a Christmas address or something that was, sort of went viral. The singing Mona Lisa, like all these sort of like things that sort of stick in our head, like, it is possible to fake this, which is why I'm glad that there are these, efforts that are ongoing to create better transparency and authentication of legitimate media. But I think ultimately it's sort of an issue of the institutions that we have that we look to and trust to sort of tell us, what is real and what is not, right? Traditionally, we've sort of looked to, media organizations like trusted sources, news, that we say, okay, well, there is some process that they undertake in order to verify and vet these things, or to generate news articles, to show us content. And I think it's super important for the media and journalists going forward to sort of not fall into the trap of like, oh, well, we've got to, maximize profits. Let's sort of lay off our news staff and have a generative AI write all the articles, right? Like there has to be some, responsibility there in terms of, ensuring the integrity of these institutions. And I think it really is, about this institutional integrity and about trust. And, the rest of it does not feel like fundamentally new in terms of the capacity or the capability to manipulate things.
Thank you, Bill. I think my favorite one of the viral images was the Pope in a Parker jacket.
Oh, yeah.
That's a really good one.
That one.
That's all we have time for today. Thank you so much to our audience for being here, and please join me.